Namaskar. Friends and listeners, I am glad to share that my poems titled Summer Death has been selected in the open category of AIFEST Poetry Contest 2020 and has been rated A grade. The organizers have asked me to video record the reading of this poem and post it on its website. Hence this humble attempt. But before I render my reading of this poem, let me give you my views on what poetry is and how I began my poetic career. When we are faced with the question what poetry is, we are simply flabbergasted. We do not know what exactly it is because it is very difficult to define. It is profound, deep, unfathomable, elusive, and indefinite or uncertain. Once Samuel Johnson, a man of great letters of the 18th century England, was asked to define what poetry is. He replied, I quote, "When you ask me, I do not know. When you do not ask me, I know what it is," unquote. From this we understand how difficult it is to define what poetry is. However, many poets in the past have defined what it is, but their conceptions are limited. No, none of their conceptions is totally comprehensive. Yet, each one of them has attempted to focus on one particular element in poetry. For me, poetry is a feeling, basically an experience. Poets, being artists, are totally different from ordinary men and women. We all act and react. We are endowed with a tremendous amount of emotions. We react quickly to any situation. But poets, being artists, do not react, but they respond. They respond because they are deeply sensitive. They are endowed with a tremendous amount of feelings. Therefore, they respond. So it is their response to a situation that undergoes a drastic transformation in the psyche, and a composition is created, and thus a poem comes into effect. For me, poetry is a feeling. Feeling needs to be distinguished from emotionality. Emotions are localized disturbances of the body-mind complex. They are not deep and profound, unlike feelings which touch the very core of our sense of experience in our body-mind complex. Emotions are not permanent. They keep changing, whereas feelings are transcendent and permanent. And for me, writing poetry is a sort of transcendental experience. Poetry is the highest form of human expression because it explores and expresses the truth of existence and life. It is for this reason poets and scientists are sworn enemies. Many philosophers dismiss poets because poets live in imagination. It is partly correct. Both poets and scientists think and imagine. I began writing poetry in the early 1980s. I never wanted to become a poet in my life. But when I took pen and scribbled a few lines that went like poetry, they sounded like poetry, as my friends have commented in those days. And then it went. Then I started looking for a publisher after years of pursuit. I finally landed with a writer's workshop in Kolkata. It was then headed by Professor P. Lal. Professor P. Lal asked me to send the manuscript. I sent the manuscript and he was so pleased, immediately wrote back to me giving his consent to take up its print. And thus my first book, Desert Blooms, was published in 1987. Thereafter, The Echoes Silent in 1988, The Images of Growing Dying City in 1989, and after 10 years of gap, I brought out another collection, Small Reflections. These first 4 books were published by the Writers' Workshop. Well, in my poetic career, lasting almost 4 decades, I have so far written and published 12 books. Of these 12 books, 7 books are single long narrative experiences. They do not contain individual poems. In fact, to tell you the truth, when I began writing poetry in 1980s, I never wrote individual poems, but I just wrote, and the lines simply spilled over. Thus, my first book, Desert Blooms, contained 1,600 lines, and the second book, Echoes Silent, a little more than 900 lines. And the third book, The Images of a Growing Dying City, comprises 85 reflections of a city. Only 4 books contain individual poems. So this is my poetic career in brief. With this brief introduction, let me go to the poem and let me present my reading of this poem, Summer Death. Well, this poem was conceived in May this year. Well, the whole world was gripped with COVID, and I encountered a couple undergoing this death experience, and it deeply touched me, and I translated it into a poem, and the poem came out with this title, Summer Death, because I encountered this experience in May, hence the title Summer Death. Let me read the poem. In the worst season of the worst year of the century, men and women perished first in single digit, then in 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, like fowls in a cold wave. Here a man, not very old, was walking in the half-dead city, with a woman on his left shoulder, like the king Vikramaditya carrying the betal. She was half-sickened with her fever, while he was half-sickened with her fever. Both could not keep up. He walked like the wind that moved from avenue to avenue, from street to street, from lane to lane, south of the city, north, then south, then southwest, then northwest. Worst was his condition with his half-sickened half. Worst was her condition with her half-sickened half. In the day, they took nothing. He sacrificed more for his half than for himself, until nightfall drenched with sweat under the falling stars, finally fell with a thud like a felled tree. Of the sinking smell of sweat, of hunger, of unfair medical treatment, of indifference. No one cared to touch nor smell in fear of the dreadful invisible virus. In her twisted legs were held his body. In his rounded arms were held her body, his forehead kissing the ground. The last hug of her body was her last gift to him. The last heat of his body was his last adieu to her. Let no one write a poem of their love. Let no one sing a dirge of their summer death. Let no one come to their threshold and inscribe on their tombs. Their death together was an utter shame to humanity. The toxins of history were let loose like balloons on their bodies. Thank you very much for listening, and I thank the organizers for selecting this poem and giving the grade, A grade to it. Thank you. Namaskar.